Check it out. We've got a 6-inch lift kit from Rough Country here. We're going to be doing it on this 2020 Ram 1500. The kit comes with brackets, spacers for the struts, new rear shocks. It's got the drop knuckles. It comes with new tie rods, tons of brackets, lots of hardware, everything you need. So measuring it at the wheel, on the driver's side, in the front, you're at a little less than 40 inches. On the rear, it's a little more than 41 inches. And the passenger side is about the same, a little less than 40 in the front and a little more than 41 in the rear. All right, let's get right into it. The first thing I need to do is support the truck. Doing this in my driveway, so I'm using some heavy-duty jack stands to support it. Get the front tires off the ground. We're gonna do the front first and then we'll do the rear later. Now take the wheels off. Now I am starting this at night just because I wanted to get it going, but not all the footage is in the dark. We'll take the axle nut off. You're gonna use standard axle nut sockets, nothing special. Then we're gonna loosen up the tie rod jam nut. Just use a wrench on that, get that free. Makes it easier than doing it later. When I'm taking the tie rod off, it just started spinning the stud, so I'm just gonna put a little pressure on it with a pry bar, pry it down a little bit, and then I'll be able to just take it off with the impact. It'll come right off. And take a hammer, just give it a tap it right out. Nice and easy. Pull that out, set it aside. The ABS wires, we want to take those off. And then we're going to take the brakes off first. We'll take the brackets off with the calipers, so take those bolts out. Just slide the caliper off. And you want to hang the caliper with a bracket. You don't want to put too much pressure on the brake hose. You don't want to break the brake hose. Oh, are you kidding me? Slide the rotor off. And then I took the ABS wire off of the vehicle. You could always disconnect the ABS wire from the hub sensor, but in my opinion, it's a little easier just to disconnect the wires and run the wires off with the hub. Now we're going to take the upper ball joint nut off. Loosen that up, and you don't have to take the nut off completely. We just want to get it so there's only a couple threads holding it on, because we're going to break it free later. And then we'll loosen up the bottom one as well. And then just put it back on with just a couple threads, just so the knuckle doesn't fall when we try to tap it off. Now just give it a couple whacks. You can use a special tool for this. If you're trying to be a little more careful with the knuckle, you might want to use a special tool. And then just pry it down, make sure it's separated. Now there's a lot of tension on this because there already is a leveling kit in this vehicle. So if you're doing this from a stock vehicle, it may not have this much tension on it. Now I'm prying down on the upper control arm just so I can get that nut off the upper ball joint. If you look at the jack stands, I have the boards underneath the jack stands at this point. That's because in hot weather, the jack stands could sink into your driveway, and I knew this was going to be multiple days. So just pull that front CV shaft out. And once you get the CV shaft out, the knuckle slides down pretty easily. Just pry that out a little bit, and it slides down. Now we can lower the floor jack. We want to take the sway bar links off.
Remove that.
Take that nut off. You can do that on both sides. And then the shock, you want to take the shock bolt out, separate that from the lower control arm. Take the nut off. Here's a little trick. You can just use the wrench, the open end, and loosen up the nut loosen up the bolt while you pull the wrench out. And sometimes that helps a little bit. I'm sure most of you know that trick. But. Now, because this does have an aftermarket setup for the leveling kit, the bolts up here are different than factory. So you're probably going to have either nuts or bolts holding that on, probably a little easier than what I had here. So I did have to use some crazy grip pliers just to pull those bolts out because they weren't cooperating too well. So pull those out. And you can see it from the top view right here. You could access that from inside if you want to, but it's just as easy to access it in the inner fender well. Just pull those out. And you can pry that shock and spring assembly out. And it slides right out. Now we're going to take the bolts off for the lower control arm. You're going to put a wrench on the cam side of the bolt, and then you can take the nut off. Keep in mind, once you loosen up these bolts, the arm is going to swing down, so you might want to support it with something. Either just put a jack stand underneath there, or just keep in mind, you just don't want it to hit you in the head or anything. Swing that down, and then take those cam bolts out. Slide those, and it comes right out. Because the lower control arm was out, it's a little bit easier to take those CV shafts out, but when you're doing that, you have the risk of having the CV shaft fall. So I just used a tie-down strap around the CV shaft so that when I hammered it out, it's not just going to fall and hit the ground. So it makes it a little bit easier, and then you just hammer it from the back side and then pull it out. You're going to take those sway bar bushing brackets off, take the sway bar out completely. And just drop it down out of the way.
For the connector, you're going to slide this piece back and then push that button and then slide it off.
I like to mark where the drive shaft goes so that when I put it back together, it's in the same location. That could prevent a vibration that's unwanted that may be avoidable if you do that. It just slides back. And I can set that down right now. I don't have to take it out completely.
So on the driver's side, you can see the back side of these two bolts that I need to remove. Those are pretty tricky from the differential. This is attached to the engine mount, so you can't take the engine mount off. From the other side, there's not much you can see. Those are the other bolts we're gonna have to remove as well from the differential, but these ones are the tricky ones, so we'll have to get on the other side. You can see next to the oil pan, you can see that one right there. It's a little bit dark. And then the other one So I can reach it from the front. If I go in through here, I can get to it there. So I'm just gonna have to reach in, just use a wrench, just try to loosen those up. But I also have to support the differential too. All right, so one of my other thoughts for trying to access those bolts is taking these bolts out and those other bracket bolts, and then seeing if I can tip this down even just a skosh, just to be able to get a swivel socket on there.
While supporting the differential, then you're going to take out the rest of the differential bolts. I chose the passenger side first. Take those out. Those are pretty easy to access. And then these 3 bolts over here are a little bit trickier to access, but it is possible.
Get those 3 out. From up here, you can see these are the bolts that I'm trying to get off. This harness is in the way. I don't know how you Dodge guys do it, how you get to those bolts. All right, from the front, it's somewhat hard to get to, but if you get past that wiring harness, you can get a ratchet in there and get it started. You're not gonna be able to take the whole thing out with the ratchet, but you can at least get it loosened up. Little by little. Finally, I got this bolt loose so that I can do it by hand. I don't know how anyone gets this bolt out. I don't know if you got an 18mm 1/4" swivel socket. That might be the way to get it, but that's absolutely ridiculous. And the back one is significantly easier. That wiring harness up there, I just pushed it up there a little bit more, and then I can get on there with a ratchet. All right, finger tight, and it's the last bolt. All right, it's 4th of July weekend. You guys know what's going on. All right, now we're at the part where everyone's gonna start to cringe. We have to cut part of the frame right here. So read the directions. Make sure for your vehicle it's maybe a little bit different depending on the model year or the model. But for mine, for this vehicle, we actually have to measure over 1 inch and cut straight along here on the driver's side. Basically, this piece is in the way of the differential, because the differential, normally the pumpkin sits right here, it's going to be sitting right here, and that's going to be in the way, so we got to cut that off. And it says use a Sawzall. You can obviously use a Sawzall if you have one. So 1 inch. Let's see, right about there. It's gonna go around, and then on the back side. So you want to trim that out there. So you want to wipe that area down with a little bit of alcohol, get that nice and clean. Then just take a little bit of paint, just a little spray paint. You could use some primer if you want and prime it first and then paint it. That'd be good. But just cover that up so it doesn't rust. That looks good. Do the same on the other. I just used the same grinder that I cut it with to clean up the edges a little. Just ground it down, and that works pretty good. If you want to, you can use some sandpaper and do that. Obviously you can't use a Sawzall to grind the edges, but yeah, it's nice and smooth now. And I'll just give a little spray paint on the edges and we'll be good. Perfect. On the differential, we're going to install this bracket. Use the factory bolts. So it is nice in the directions. There is a general torque spec guide. So if you measure the bolts, this is about a 7/16 bolt, and it gives you a range between 45 and 60 foot-pounds, which is about what I was guessing. So at least you get a general idea for the torque specs. Do the best you can with the torque specs. Now we're going to take this bracket. It's going to go right there. I think it's going to have to be removed anyway. Now we're going to install this bracket on the passenger side with the factory hardware. Just take the mounting bracket off the wiring harness. You're going to have to bend this out just a little bit, like that. That should go on there. And use the factory bolts. Now we're going to install this bracket right here from underneath the vehicle, and you want that notch going towards the back of the vehicle. You can see it's almost like it moves the differential out a little bit, so like that. This would be much easier to do with two people. Lined up in there. Let's go forward a little. Lined up. Alright, I got all the bolts in except for this one. They are a little bit tricky to get them all lined up. Just use a screwdriver and just try to get them all lined up, and then we'll torque them to the specs on the sheet. I'm going to tighten these bolts first and then the other ones. And I'm still going to leave the jack underneath just to keep pressure on that.
Now we're going to connect the wiring harness to the actuator. Can't reach like that. We're going to have to remove this tab right here, this retainer. Pop that off. Gives you a little more slack. So there's the connector right there. We'll slide that connector off as well. Now we can connect that, lock it down, and using a wire tie, we're gonna wire tie this out of the way. Yeah, that's not gonna hit anything. Alright, so I did that. Got a little bit of slack right there, not too bad. And this isn't going to go anywhere. That's not going to be hitting the boot or anything. That's good. There we go. And when you go to put the drive shaft back in, there is this little guard right here. This little plastic guard that's going to be in the way. So you have to get out a tape measure and just measure and cut 3/4 of an inch off the guard. Alright, looks good. Alright, we have this spacer that's going to go on the pinion flange. Right there. It's going to go like that. I'm going to put some Loctite on these because I don't want these loosening up. I'm sure in the instructions it states different areas where to use Loctite, but I feel like this is pretty important to not loosen up. Just medium strength Loctite. I did mark this coming off. That's just a habit I do. I think it's a good habit to get into. Just to put it back to the way it was. Line this up. Alright, then we're going to torque these to 75 foot-pounds. Just going to use a pry bar, prevent it from spinning. You just see a grip right there.
And now we're going to install the front cross member. And before I install that nut on there, we have to put this bracket on because this is going to go over that. This is going to drop down for the sway bar. Use the factory hardware for the sway bar. Then tighten those down. And then you can put this nut on. Then you're going to tighten that down as well. Do that on both sides. Before you torque all these bolts, before you tighten them down, you want to put the lower control arms in. Get those at least hung so everything's lined up, and then you go back and torque these 4 bolts. Alright, do the same on the other side. Now that the control arms are in, I can tighten these bolts down and then torque them to 170 foot-pounds. Now I gotta put the skid plate on with the necessary hardware, nuts and bolts. So it's gonna go like that. Before you go to install the large spacer on the spring and shock assembly, you're going to need to add a smaller spacer that goes between the spring and the mount. To do that, you're going to have to compress the spring so that you can take the mount off. Then you can put that spacer on, then put the mount back on and tighten down the nut. Now you're going to need a professional spring compressor to do this. There's a lot of tension on these springs, so you may have to bring the springs somewhere to have someone do this for you. Next, we have to put the studs through this spacer. There's a little bit of paint on there, so it's a little bit tricky to get that started. If you just take the stud and just kind of get it started, work it through, you can get it in there. Just twist it a little bit. If you had to, you'd probably take a little sandpaper and just sand that down a little bit. Either way, take the stud, and then there's a nut in here that's oversized. Slide that on there, and then another nut. Slide that on, and tighten that on. And using a wrench, they specifically say don't use an impact. Just tighten this down. Alright, that stud's all the way down. And just do the same for the other ones. Now take the strut that you already put that spacer in, and you want to take this and you're going to line this up. Take the factory hardware and get these started. And look at the top. The space away from these two is larger than the gap right there, so it only goes on one way. And obviously you want to torque those to factory specs.
Now we can install the strut assembly, line those up, get those nuts started on top. All right, with those loose up top, and we can slide this in down below. If you have to twist this, if you didn't line that up properly, you can just take a bar, put it in here, and twist it a little bit either direction just to make this line up. Then take the factory shock nut and bolt, line this up, put that through, put the nut on. And we're not going to tighten this down yet. This has to get tightened when the vehicle weight is all the way down on it. Same with the lower control arm bushings. You don't want to tighten those until all the weight is on the vehicle. So leave those loose for now. Now take the axle, line it up, and slide it in place. There you go. We're going to transfer over the hub and backing shield over to the new knuckle. I would hope this hub would just come right out, but it's probably not going to be the case. Because we're in New England and nothing comes out that simple. See if I just can hammer these out a little bit. Oops, take those off. Alright, set that aside. Just going to clean up some of the corrosion right here. Alright, I'm just going to use a little anti-seize just around here for corrosion, just for the future. Now slide this right over. Obviously you know where the brake bracket goes and the ABS harness comes on this side. Bolts in. You're going to use the factory hardware for this. And then torque those to spec. And do the same on the other side. Then you want to transfer this clip over to here. Snug it down. Now take the extremely heavy knuckle, install it on the lower control arm and the axle. I would recommend holding the nut in your hand when you do this. Try not to bend the shield. There you go, your axle nut. I'm going to pry down on the upper and get that in. Get that started. Surprisingly, this is actually a little easier than when I had the smaller just leveling kit in there. Prying this down to get that nut in is actually pretty easy, which makes it awesome. All right, so that's good. Now we gotta tighten those down, tighten the axle nut down. We got new tie rods as well. And make sure you tighten those down. It's looking good. We're getting there. You can count the threads if you want. That was 20 for this side. 1, 2, 3. It's really not going to make a difference. You still need an alignment. I'm going to try to adjust it slightly. Put that nut on. Raising up on the knuckle a little bit. Can use the pry bar. Pry down on the upper control arm, and I can tighten that nut. "26 foot-pounds and 180 degrees. Same on that one. So double check the torque. It's 28 and then 195. Now I'm going to torque the nut to 184. Alright. I'll pretty much do the same on the other side. Alright, before we mount the brakes, we have to move this. I'm going to take this nut off, this bolt out. I'm going to pull this out. I wonder if this would have been easier to do with this off. So the brake hose goes through here, and they want you to carefully cut right there so that you can get this out without cutting the brake line. Alright. Let's slide this out. Alright, so I cut a slot that's a little bigger just so I can slide this out. It'll be a little easier. Running out of daylight. Alright, so I'm able to get that off. And this has to slide down. So you want that down like this, out of the way. And then there's a new bracket that's going to go there. Alright, here's the bracket we're going to use. Just slide this on here. Again, do this before you put the control arm on. This is a good idea. Then you're going to take the factory hardware, get that started right there. Alright, so that looks good here. Make sure you kind of have this pulled out a little bit. You don't want the brake line rubbing
right there because it was hitting on the bracket, so I had to move it over. Now I can put the brake caliper bolts back in. Those are good. For the ABS wire, this retainer would go all the way up here, and then this other one on the frame here. Now with this one still in the frame, it's really tight. So I'm not gonna have that one in there. That's too tight. You don't want the ABS wire that tight. So I'm gonna leave that out. What is recommended is taking this off, cutting this off, and then wire tying it to the brake hose. You can use this thing right here. I mean, I don't know if that's the best method, but if that's what you got, it'll probably be okay. So I'd rather secure the wire up here to that hose, and then I guess I can secure it down there. So you might have to mess around with that ABS wire. So make sure you at least plug it back in. That will work like that. A little bit different. Put those right there. That drop bracket. And slide the link into the lower control arm. I'll just get these all started first. The sway bar's already tightened down. I tightened down all those bolts. Now I want to tighten down the link. And I'm going to torque those to 88 foot-pounds. So now that I put the lift kit on, I actually can't physically put the wheel on. The truck is still at the same level it was when I took the wheels off, but the suspension has dropped down that much since putting it on. So I gotta jack up the suspension. Alright, so I do have 2 floor jacks. I'm just gonna pump up each side little by little, trying to be safe. Go up a screw more. And now that it's on the ground, we can torque those bolts. So do the best you can. You want to torque the lower shock bolt and also the cam bolts for the lower control arms. Otherwise, you're going to wear out suspension parts a lot faster. But don't forget to tighten those down. Now's a good time to do that. There's plenty of room under here. You can crawl under there. Or if you have to, you can put it up on ramps and try that. A little bit tricky doing on your back. Wheels off. Now I gotta take out all these screws for the inner fender well. I'm gonna pull that all out. Take all those out. Just use a 8mm socket.
Then you can access the top of the shock on the rear. And there's not much room, but you can access the top of where the spring is, because we're gonna have to access right here. And then we're gonna support the rear axle. Use some jack stands underneath there. I got jack stands on both sides, and I just have the floor jack underneath the pumpkin. We'll just leave that there for now. It's gonna drop down a little bit, and then we're gonna actually have to lower it even more. Take off the sway bar link. Take that off. I'm just gonna use some vice grips on the bottom. Upper rear shock nuts. Take those off. I'll take off the lower shock bolt. Use a 21mm wrench on the nut, 21mm socket. Take that off. The shock is loose, so this will slide right out. I don't know how low I can go. Pay attention to brake lines, brake hoses, and any cables or anything. This brake hose is getting pretty tight right here, so before I drop this down anymore, I am going to take that off. Use a 13mm socket. That way this is loose. Just can pull it down a little bit more. In most situations, you should be able to just grab this spring and pull it out. I think because I have this spacer here from the leveling kit, these springs really won't come out. You have to take this bar off anyway, so we're going to disconnect this bar, and I believe these have to be disconnected anyway. Then I should be able to drop this down even more. Either way, we have a bracket that's going to go right there, so I'm going to take that bolt out. And then we have a bracket that's gonna go right there. This is gonna go right there. So we'll take those out, this bolt, that bolt, and then the same on the other side. Just making sure everything's supported. Looks good. Just fits in there. See, when they did this kit, they should have loosened those bolts up and then retorqued them. That shouldn't have been like that. That's gonna wear those bushings out really quick. There we go. Now I can get the spring out. Perfect. Yeah, this is pulling pretty hard over here. Crank that up a little bit. Just gonna pop this ABS wire off right here. All right. Normally you're not going to have this, so don't worry about this. There we go. Just clean that up with a wire brush a little bit. All right, so. Where the spring goes on the mount, you're going to take this little plate. It's going to go on top of there. You can reach over there. It's gonna sit in there, and then take the spring extender and the long bolt, slide that up there. You're gonna get that thread threaded in. That started. And do that on both sides. Now I'll use a wrench, hold the nut up top, tighten it up. Just a 15mm wrench. It's tight, do the same on the other side. In the instructions it says remove a nut on the bracket right here. This vehicle doesn't have that nut on either side. And we have this little piece right here. So this bracket's gonna go here. There's this piece that's gonna go in between here. You kinda have to try to force it in there. And then the bolt's gonna go through and then a big nut on the other side. We're gonna put this bracket on. Just slide that in position. Use the proper hardware. These bolts with washers. Start these ones first. And before we tighten those up, I'm going to slide this bolt in with this spacer in the middle. So it takes a little bit to get that spacer in. Slide the bolt in. And the big nut on the back side. So it's going to look like that. Those bolts there. Tighten those down, and then I'll tighten this bolt down. Then we have to drill some holes. And we're going to drill through this hole and through the other hole. Now put these bolts in, bolt, washer, nut. Tighten these down and torque them. Now you have the bump stop extensions to put on, and you have this hardware. It's not real specific about these nuts where you put these. I'm assuming because you're not going to be able to get a wrench on the other side, you put those on the other side, on the driver's side. And do the other side and use these. Now we're going to install this bracket. This is the drop down for the track bar. There's a large bolt that goes in the middle, and then you have to slide this piece in, and you want this on the inside, and then you put a bolt up from underneath. You can slide it in on this side. Just get that lined up in there. Larger bolt's going to go through there. Smaller bolt up underneath, and get that nut lined up. And then tighten those down. Then I'll tighten the other one. Alright, so the whole differential kind of has to be rotated forward a little bit, and because these bushings are so tight, you're not able to do that. So I'm actually going to loosen up these bolts. You really should loosen up all the bolts, and then when it's on the ground, re-torque them. You don't want to mess up the bushings or cause premature wear on the bushings. To be able to get these springs in, I am going to use at-home spring compressors. Now I wouldn't trust these doing the front struts, only because these are not that strong, but I should be able to get a couple inches, make this a little bit smaller so that I can fit these in here without being too dangerous. So just go side by side. Okay, I can go a little lower. I was able to get the other bolt in the other side for that, so that twists it up a little more. Still not quite there. I can use a pry bar. There we go. All right, now I can take these off. Do the same on the other side. So yeah, just get that bolt through on the other side before you do this, before you try to put the spring in. All right, good. Let me grab. All right, that's lined up. Bolt in there. You can see that the shocks are a lot longer. I wanted to put the shields over, but if you put them on, they're not going to even reach. So I'm not going to put those on. So these are just open, which I wish there was a shield on them, but that's okay. Now, just before I put them in, I'm just gonna compress them. And then let them extend. I'll do that 3 times before I put them in. I'll get these started. Now there's one washer that's got a different diameter hole. Put that one on first. And the bushing, just like that. You can slide it in position. And the washer. Push it up. There's a couple threads just to get the knot on. And the shock bolt. Now it said there was a new shock bolt, but I don't know, maybe I used one of the wrong bolts in the wrong spots because it's really thin. I'm just going to use the factory bolt. Cutting that up to factory specs. Now I'm putting on this bracket. This is for the brake hose right here. Drivers and passenger side are different, so get the right one. Now you have to send a bolt through here. It might be easier to go this way and hold the nut in there. Well, either way, a bolt or a nut has to go through there. There you go. It's not quite as bad as I thought. Slide that through there. Get that nut started. And take the standard hardware that comes with the vehicle. Tighten that down. Just make sure that brake line's out of the way. It looks good. All right, make sure you put that track bar, bolt, and nut back in place. And the suspension is raised up and supported, so this is at drive level where it's going to be. So I can actually go around and tighten all the bolts and torque them. There we go. Now you can put the sway bar links in, reuse the old hardware up top. Down below, you have a new bolt, goes through. Put the washer on. And the nut. And tighten those down. Alright, that's good. Do the same on the other side. All right, this thing is huge now. Let's check the measurements. At the front wheel, they're about 40, let's see, about 43.5. On the rear, about 44.5. Same with the passenger side, 44.5. And passenger side is 44.5, about 44.5. Now it still needs an alignment and it still needs the 37-inch tires, but that's pretty impressive. Looks real nice. All right, you made it this far, so you're obviously interested. I do a lot of automotive and mechanical type stuff and also some reviews, so consider subscribing. I'd appreciate it. Thanks.